pages 364 to 365. Uncertainty in the face of an unknown and dangerous world, fear of what is different, deep doubts, anxieties, projections, defensive reactions, prejudices, and resistance, led the European to safeguard his identity before the independent nations on the other side of the Atlantic. This fact activated certain defensive mechanisms, the idea of seeing oneself as the navel of the world, thus compensating for feelings of doubt, loss, helplessness, fear, uncertainty, and amazement. An explanation had to be given to the existence of an unknown new world. It was difficult to interpret and give a definitive answer that can be explained by the theological and philosophical ideas prevailing at the time. They searched the sacred scriptures, and the doctrine of original sin, for answers based on biblical foundations, through lengthy discussions to try to understand the origin and nature of the exotic American savage man. Startled by deep doubts, they lacked a certain knowledge to elucidate a strange, mysterious world, and that they could not explain in the current state of their knowledge. The savage is a state prior to the barbarian, they do not know how to make fire, they are refractory to civilization, they do not know clothing and eat raw meat, they have no society, no language, and live according to nature. Gerby, 1960, pages 356 to 362. Fabre d'Olivet comes to the conclusion that the continent called America is the island Atlantis that was populated by the red race. A flood catastrophe fell suddenly on the island as a consequence of the sin of the peoples. This deluge was produced by a sudden movement of the globe that raised the boreal pole and turned its waters towards the southern pole, submerging it. The Reds drowned, being able to save those who took refuge in the highlands. Gerby, 1960, p. 368. As a consequence of this biblical curse, men were left weak, beardless, without muscular strength, and virile, in such a way that some men had milk on their nipples. Without intellectual gifts, they remained in a state of childhood, with atrophied faculties. Their racial color is of poor quality, they do not belong to a pure breed due to crossings and infected mixtures, and in the same way, the animal and plant species have been altered. There is a feminization of the American savage man. The denial of the masculinity of the inhabitants of the New World, and a feminine construction of the continent. They are generally described according to the concept of women at that time, an intermediate state between man and child. They are counted as weak, unmanly, childish, and with mammary glands. The fact that they did not present hairiness had a meaning of weakness for the European, since the virile man should be hairy because it was an important trait of masculinity for the time. The natives of the New World were constantly feminized. The woman and the child were not considered people, the child was a kind of blank slate, an empty brain that had to be filled with knowledge, and both lacked their own identity. The concept of inferiority and weakness was related to the feminine, the decrepit, the beardless, and the stupid, it was related to childhood. Gerby notes that Humboldt preserved some amusing examples of these romantic hermeneutical and defining nonsense, such as the following sentence: America is a feminine form, long, slender, wet, and icy on the 48th parallel. The degrees of latitude are the years, the woman ages at 48. Canada is the menopause of the continent. Gerby, 1960, p. 384. In the same way as the savage, the woman for Schopenhauer remains in an intermediate state between man and child. According to the German philosopher, women are not made for great efforts. And he goes on to say the following: what makes women particularly apt to care for and educate us in early childhood is that they themselves continue to be childish, futile, and limited in intelligence. Big children remain all their lives, a kind of intermediate between the boy and the man. Schopenhauer, N.D., p. 67. The New World is transformed for the European, in the unconscious representation of the feminine and infantile aspects of the time, concepts that have been associated with the traits of weakness, famished, stupid, inferior, without identity, precocious, beardless, not very virile, weak, without war capacity. Reducing the links to purely biological conditions, Otto Weininger stated that The relationship between man and woman is the same as that of subject and object. The woman seeks to be considered as an object. It is the property of the man or the offspring, and despite its manifestations to the contrary, it can only be accepted as one thing. The woman does not want to be treated as a subject. At all times and in all circumstances she wishes to remain passive, feeling directed by a will, and refuses to be contemplated and esteemed. Its true need is to be bodily desired and to constitute a property of others. Weininger, 1942, pages 390 to 391. These concepts about women of a nomothetic, logical, and evident character, have still lasted to this day, and constitute a dimension of the historical expansionist colonialist forces transmuted from the past, whose original contents were distorted in the form of sexual, racial, and cultural logic. They constitute the same dichotomous expansionist forces that were distorted under political, biological, legal, psychological, and philosophical forms. The same dichotomous forces that from ancient times divided humanity into saved and condemned through Judeo-Christian religious interpretation and imposition, later separating savage peoples from civilized nations, are the same ones that have divided it into men subjects and women objects. This subject man is the unconscious representation of the conqueror, and the object represents the conquered, the weak, the passive, the discarded, the exploited, the plundered, the wild. From the irrational and unconscious aspects, the obvious idea was kept in mind that the old world discovers the new world as man possesses and discovers woman, who becomes his property. The new world represents the feminine aspects, and the old world the masculine. In the same way as the woman does not belong to herself, but belongs to the man, America does not belong to herself, she belongs to Europe. It is not the voice, but the echo of the European voice. The new world appears as a female representation. It must always be inferior to the old world who discovered it. The new world must always be imperfect, powerless, weak, flabby. The new world appears inexperienced. It is minor, imperfect, recent, not finished, geologically young, and humid. The new world needs to be the object of the old world which gives it meaning. The new world is the property of the old world. The new world is passive, and the old world is active. One is lazy, and the other is industrious. One submits and the other submits. The new world is ductile. It allows itself to be influenced and suggested just like women. Therefore it must be transformed, modeled by the old world. The new world does not represent anything, you can do whatever you want with it. It has no identity of its own. On the other hand, the old world has its own identity. In new world it will not be able to develop without the old world totally dependent on it, in the same way as the woman totally depends on the man. The new world lacks of content, soul, and will. The inhabitants of the new world are considered stupid beings, weak-minded, and should be civilized by the old world. As the new world acquires, European masculinity will gradually become civilized. It will have become a man, abandoning its feminine characteristics, thus achieving a normal nature, but never equal to the European one. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the terms spirit of were in common use: spirit of nations, national spirit, spirit of laws, spirit of law, spirit of the age, spirit of the people, positive spirit, or was also used to designate organic realities as animal spirits. Hegel speaks of the absolute idea as if it were the same as the spirit. The spirit is everything, before being everything, or the truth of everything. The spirit begins with a partial truth that needs to be completed. It is universal, not particular, and it unfolds itself, until it reaches a state of unfolding. Upon reaching its last state of its enlargement, the spirit recognizes itself as a truth that is only such, because it has absorbed error, negativity, and partiality. Ferrater Mora points out the three Hegelian notions of the spirit: the subjective spirit, the objective spirit, and the absolute spirit. The philosophy of the spirit as a subjective spirit studies the emergence of the spirit from a situation of sinking in nature, the development of consciousness, and the development of the subject as a practical, moral, and theoretical, knowing, subject. The philosophy of the spirit as an objective spirit studies the ways in which the subjective spirit fixes on morality, the state, and history. The philosophy of the spirit as absolute spirit studies the fulfillment of the evolution, or self-development of the spirit in art, religion, and philosophy. The last stage is the history of philosophy itself, culminating in the Hegelian system of the spirit. Mora, 1969. In philosophy, the term spirit is used in various senses, and in different contexts. Ferrater Mora affirms that the term spirit comes from the Latin spiritus, which, although it originally designates breath, exhalation, has also been used frequently to refer to something essentially immaterial, and endowed with reason. The word spirit can be used as a general term, which designates all the various modes of being that somehow transcend the vital. Something opposite to matter and flesh, the spirit is strong, but the flesh is weak. It is important that we know that the origin of the term spirit, among many others, has a theological meaning. The reference that Ferrater Mora makes between the dichotomy between spirit and flesh is precisely taken from one of the Gospels, footnote, MT 26:41. Watch and pray so that you do not enter into temptation, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. End of footnote. Similarly, he asserts that the spirit of the people, Volksgeist, is used by Hegel and generally by German Romanticism. When referring to the spirit of the peoples, Hegel defines the internal life in the spirit of a determined people, as formed by their customs, laws, and constitution. It is the feeling that a people has of itself, its possessions, institutions, customs, its past, which constitutes an entity. It is a spirit determined by history. The universal spirit is geographically broader, and is formed by the concurrence and relationship with each other, of the various peoples throughout history. The concepts related to the spiritual, the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, from a theological dimension, passed through time, to secularly integrate the concepts of nation, laws, science, politics, European philosophy. Through a process of theological refinement and secularized integration of the components already refined from unconscious aspects, it was gradually produced from a certain time and geographical space. An unconscious process of theological despiritualization has been developed to build a spiritual secular construction. However, the theological components have not completely dissolved, they have been transmuted from one typology to another, already deformed and unrecognizable as such, but continued to a certain extent, influencing effectively under other substitute forms. From my point of view, Hegel inadvertently presents himself as a messianic manifestation, someone who prophetically enunciates the fulfillment and installation of an absolute and definitive universal truth. This Hegelian messianism results from the transmutation process of the various biblical messianisms, transforming Anglo-Saxon Europe into the new promised land, the end of universal history, truth, and maturity, where the dove of the Spirit has been completed. It has descended, it has descended, it has settled, in a determined and predestined geographical space. The philosophy of Hegelian history contains certain ideas transmuted from the Western Judeo-Christian philosophy of religious history, or rather from the Western theology of history. From the unconscious aspects, the lost Adamic paradise must be recovered and reinstalled, symbolically transferred from the Euphrates and the Tigris to the German regions. The theology of history has an irreversible character, already destined before the foundation of the world, in such a way that nothing and nobody can modify the historical facts that have already been determined and predestined by Providence. Everything that happens historically was already planned in advance by a supreme and inevitable design. On the other hand, for Hegel, everything that does not arise from the result of the dialectical triad, cannot be part of what he understands as universal history. The contempt for southern Africa among many other continents is due to its passivity and the lack of the dialectical movement, in such a way that there can be no history in those backward regions. Hegel's dialectic is a Darwinian dialectic, where synthesis is the result of the survival of the fittest. Chapter 2. Eurocentrism and Racism. In school textbooks. From educational institutions, this form of oppression, racism, is not usually considered as problematic. Both the political authorities and the professors often see themselves as objective people, neutral, and that, consequently, they do not facilitate the production and reproduction of racist behavior. However, when ethnographic analyses are carried out inside classrooms, or curricular materials are reviewed, very soon behaviors appear before our eyes that invalidate the self-images of neutrality that the educational system offers. Torres Santome. In the first place, we must highlight here the pyramidal, Eurocentric, tax character, and the school indoctrination until today. Nor does secondary and university education escape the Eurocentric influence. Although racism in school books has gradually weakened, certain residues still remain. The current manifestations of racism in school textbooks are more subtle. According to Van Dijk, immigrants are not represented, diversity is not celebrated, differences are emphasized and not similarities, stereotypes of poverty, lack of modernity, and backwardness are created. The European continues to have positive attributions. The we is used to refer to technologically advanced, informed, and democratic people, while the others are violent, criminal, illegal, drug users, authoritarian, lazy, and backward. The others are represented as passive, they are written and talked about, but they are not presented with their own opinion and even less criticizing us. The European and Western society, and the so-called First World countries, are ranked. A large number of writers have dedicated themselves to studying the content of school textbooks in relation to racism. In these texts, colonialism is legitimized, knowledge of the original nations is not considered, realities are built, exploitation is made invisible, cultural hegemony is reinforced. The Afro-descendant and the Indian have not been protagonists in the national identity. The discourse produces and reproduces ideological evaluations, justifications, injustice, and discrimination are reproduced. It is spoken with total naturalness of the discovery of America, and that Europeans have been explorers. Europe appears as superior, a universal culture. The story arises from the presence of the European in our continent. These manuals express a covert, racist, discriminatory and Eurocentric ideology. Colonialism has built a separation between a us and a them. The we represents the European and its colonies, and is imposed as a culture, legitimate, developed and progressive. Language, religion, and culture mark the boundary between what is ours and what is other, what is civilized and what is wild, what is true and what is false. We, the technological, modern, and developed First World, and the others, the Third World, inefficient, unproductive, rural and rudimentary. Likewise, decolonization is related to begging. National identity is a cultural construction of we, of belonging, and cohesion. School textbooks are thus a device in the construction of nationalisms and identities. In its beginnings, geography was extremely necessary in the colonizing and predatory process of the continents plundered by the European colonies. It was necessary to know the topography of the continents in order to enter them. It is used to combine the relationship of race and a specific geographical environment that produces an individualized culture. Geography was applied by colonialism as a form of scientific and expansionist justification of the superiority of the European over non-European peoples, between us and them. In school textbooks, the clergy appear playing an independentist role in the construction of the state, and the conquerors of America are built as protagonists, brave, faithful, just, heroes, noblemen, self-sacrificing, victims of the attacks of the Indians, and designated by God to carry the culture, idealized under a messianic character. Religion guides the process towards the morale of the nation. The Spanish language is the hegemonic language, and it is associated with harmony and clarity, being superior to other languages. School textbooks have been the vehicle of racist ideologies, in which the white, European, and Northern man is interpreted as a superior race. Afro-descendant slaves are presented as mentally retarded, the issue of slavery is silenced, the slave trade is hidden, civilization is interpreted as a construction against barbarism, the murder of thousands of indigenous is recognized, but as a regrettable sacrifice that made possible the development of civilization. In school texts, the indigenous are interpreted as incorporated into nature, as a dangerous and exotic animal, as incomplete beings, enemies, antagonistic, dangerous, fierce, cannibals, poor and miserable, who do not feel suffering. Instead, the violence of the Spanish, and in a broad sense that of the colonizers itself, is described as natural. The we is adopted by the dominant ideology, attributing positive qualities to certain elites or groups: beauty, civilization, wealth, goodness, nobility, progress. On the other hand, the others are seen as inferior beings. These manuals establish boundaries between us and them, between rich and poor, white and black, Europeans and non-Europeans, heterosexuals and homosexuals. White, heterosexual, married, and wealthy men are generally spoken of as unquestionable, exceptional, intelligent, and morally great. Most of the characters are male, women appear only as male companions or in support of the latter. The qualities of the character are expanded and their errors are reduced or disdained. Oftentimes, the character who is presented as compassionate can be despotic or cruel and authoritarian. Subordinate collectives are underestimated, and are attributed passive qualities, vices. They are seen as rude, vulgar, and poor beings. The type of man and woman that is convenient to the ruling classes is exposed and imposed. Social inequality is naturalized. It is omitted to speak about labor exploitation. The idea that Europe is the model of civilization is promoted. It is related to the technological, civilized, cultured, democratic, and it is identified with Christianity, freedom and progress, and is exposed as a universal culture favored by geographical conditions, a civilized continent and of a white race which is associated with a state of moral and material perfection, and colonialism is justified as a necessary expansion, culturally and economically. The plundering of the conquered nations is interpreted as a necessary civilizing mission. The presence of Europeans in America is a victory for Christianity, progress, and technology against barbarism. It is assumed that the identity of the continent and the national history began with the arrival of Europeans. There are no illustrations of blacks or indigenous people. These are secondary, they go unnoticed historically, they appear as a background and the European as a figure. Evangelization has been designed so that the others learn the true religion and enter the civilized world, to be incorporated into the Christian civilization, and give them their language and culture, justifying violence by stating that there was no other means to impose Christianization. The existence of the Spanish, European, Western, First World conqueror, is considered harmonious, prosperous, generous, equitable, in comparison with the rest of the uncivil world. European culture appears in school textbooks, associated with civilization, hiding, justifying or silencing domination and validating itself at the same time as the bearer of civilization. Colonization appears as a necessary means to achieve this progress. Van Dijk analyzed social science texts aimed at the second and third years of compulsory secondary education in Spain, written in Spanish and Catalan, published in 2002 and 2003. He expresses that there is a categorization of a we, those from the north, the from Europe, those from Spain, and a they from the south or the third world. This polarized concept between south and north results from the Hegelian and heliodromic influence, which we have already seen. The developed nations appear as democratic, technologically advanced. The photographs show intellectual white people, working on the computer, and the middle-class family, wealthy white, well-dressed and smiling. In school textbooks, Europe appears to have a global regenerative mission. The burden of the white man, forced to civilize for the good of humanity, having the mission of expanding progress to the third world through humanitarian actions. In the hegemonic discourse, fundamental facts that compromise us are omitted, interpretation is distorted, details of why certain events happened are not explained, they are omitted, racism is mitigated, attention is diverted to another place, towards the others are alluded to complexity and their difficulty in knowing the subject, censorship, generalization, stereotypes are used, enemies are built, disqualified, hatred, cruelty and greed are projected over another, silencing, omitting, discarding and belittling the positive of the other. The situations are not deepened, differences are emphasized and not similarities. Integration is confused with assimilation to a supposed mother culture. The inferior cultures become necessary to establish the superiority of something. You cannot be superior to nothing, we need something or someone to become inferior to feel safe, valuable, superior, advanced, civilized, cultured, ordered, and for this, we must build an object to compare ourselves to, submit to. And submit through a bond of dependency. Young people are taught that there was really a discovery of a continent called America, and no one can doubt that the peoples that inhabited that continent were savages. There was also a differentiation within the savages, in which there were other peoples in Mexico, Peru, and Cundinamarca that were not so wild, because they had a certain degree of culture. The nation-state construction process was solidified based on racism, discrimination, and contempt for minorities, in order to achieve homogeneity with European logic and the elimination of everything that does not correspond to this logic. The imposition of the Christian religion, the Castilianization, and ultimately, the loss of the identity of the original nations, represent important causes to achieve assimilation. I have already pointed out that the concept of racism should not only be interpreted based on certain phenotypic traits such as skin color. This concept of racism is to a large extent the destiny of a historically transmuted formation, of a racism long before the 19th century of a religious nature, manifested under monocentric forces, which potentially compress within themselves these embryonic and to a certain extent drowsy tendencies in the weather. Similarly, nation-states, driven by these same ancient monotheocentric forces, viewed polyglossia as actually a burden, an obstacle to consciousness. In such a way that the same existence, far from being diverse, varied, heterogeneous, multiple, has to respond to the authoritarian unity of all things, under the authority of a single absolute power, where diversity and heterogeneity are rejected. Arturo Jorich notably expresses this lack in normal school education. It understands the school as a colonizing instrument, which contributes to the dissolution of the national identity, assimilating a foreign identity. It constitutes the reproducer of the Sarmientine scheme of civilization and barbarism. The school is not aimed at educating men and women, but citizens. The school taught us botany and technical zoology with cryptogams and phanerogams, vertebrates and invertebrates, but it told us nothing about the botany and zoology before us. We knew about the platypus from the school and the baobab from Salgari, but nothing about baguales or Guaimpedo cattle, and we ignored the chinar, which was the first designation of the town until it was given the sufficiently cultured name of Lincoln. It is known that nothing helps progress as much as the gringo name, as established by Sarmiento when he renamed Belleville Fraile Muerto. Jorich, 1975, pages 165 to 166. However, European centrism extends far beyond primary education, in such a way that it encompasses education itself, its entirety, secondary and university. Eurocentrism has thus become a naturalized, internalized and uncritical influence, the questioning of which is practically unthinkable. It has been culturally absorbed, inhabiting our unconscious since our early childhood. We were born with it, it is part of our culture and it has been built for centuries. Questioning Eurocentrism implies realizing its existence, looking at ourselves, questioning our culture. Everything we touch leaves us with the Eurocentric tinge. Scientists, writers, psychologists, historians, sociologists, educators, philosophers, artists, teachers, and in a general sense, we are all to some extent influenced by this hardly detectable and therefore questionable logic. Jorich wondered in the late 1960s. What to say now of the formation of our so-called upper classes, in which parents handed over to foreign governesses and schools the purification of every trait they might inherit. It is known that Victoria Ocampo needs to think in French and translate into Spanish. Alicia Jurado in her biography of Borges has informed us that her character learned to read first in English then in our language, perhaps because English and French are cultured languages. Not so the Italian, the Polish, and even the same Spanish. If this happens among writers, what could happen in the rest of high society at the end of the last century and the beginning of the current? Eton, Harrow, difficult to access, the Swiss and French boarding schools, completed the work of the governesses or if not the religious schools of foreign orders. Jorich, 1975, p. 181. The European understood by savage, first of all, any culture that is not European. Second, these peoples were judged as ignorant because they were not Christians, they did not belong to this religion that had established itself as the European religion. It bothered them that these peoples do not have family life, and that marriage and the Christian family were unknown, that is, the typical family as conceived by the European, husband, wife, and children. In addition, pagans and idolaters were considered to be those who had other religious beliefs that were alien to the European. Likewise, they were uncomfortable with the nudity that many peoples had as a practical matter, understanding that an offense was committed before God, since in Genesis, Adam and Eve covered their private parts when they became aware of their disobedience. Third, from a technological point of view, many of these peoples were considered senile, without taking into account other wealth and knowledge. From the unconscious aspects, this way of judging them as inhuman or less human, meant a form of rationalization, of blamelessness, which somehow enabled oppression and plunder. That is, if they are not human, we should not feel guilty. Before vilification, the greater the phylogenetic approach with animals, the greater the oppressive justification that protects the oppressor. Chapter 3. Nexus and Bond. I have differentiated the concept of nexus from the bond. In the first, learning is unidirectional, that is, it starts from the communicating source towards the receiver. On the other hand, in the bond a dialectical process of communication and learning is manifested where there is an exchange of knowledge between the sender and the receiver, either because the subjects are physically present, or although absent, but communicating through electronic means, resulting in productive reciprocity, and generating mutual learning and change. While in the bond we learn and teach from each other, in the nexus we only learn from the other. When we find ourselves reading a book or an article, or watching and listening to a video of a certain author who is absent, and that experience provides us with learning that produces changes in our lives, we say that we have had a nexus with that author. Said author may be absent because he is a deceased person, or although he is still alive, he is not present at that very moment. In the face of asymmetric and unilateral learning, in the face of paper and ink, I am prevented from any possibility of conversation with that author who is not present. However, that reality does not prevent me from learning from him, and establishing a one-sided nexus, not a link, with that absent, perhaps unknown, anonymous, or ignored character. In asymmetric learning, knowledge is received unilaterally from the electronic medium, or is detached from paper. This expression reminds me, as an example, of the beautiful poem that Rubén Darío dedicated in tribute to the Spanish poet Ramón de Campo Amor. This one with white hair, like the fur of an ermine, combined his childish candor with his experience as an old man. When you hold a book by such a man in your hand, a bee is every expression that, flying from the paper, leaves honey on your lips and stings in your heart. Rubén Darío has received unilaterally, through a nexus, the inspiration of the Spanish poet to whom he has dedicated the poem. Darío expresses symbolically that expressions come off from the pages of his books as if they were bees, which can fly and reach the reader, leaving the sweetness of honey in his mouth, and then penetrate the most intimate of his being. Beyond paper and ink, there are affections, experiences, wisdom, reflection, and change. The author has left a legacy and will never know the influence that his works can inspire in the people who read it. Being influenced by one other is actually equivalent to being simultaneously influenced by many unknown others, by affects, concepts, and ideas, of many others. Each library contains infinities of other libraries and authors, where each author has structured their knowledge at the same time, based on a multiplicity of other knowledge from different geographical places, from different authors, whether contemporary or extemporaneous, living or deceased, men and women from various fields of knowledge. The influence that we receive at a given moment in history comes far beyond our primary ties, extends into historical space and time, has been building for hundreds of years. When we are surprised or question certain affirmations of an author, we are questioning at the same time and without realizing it, the culture in which our author lived, the influence that this has exerted on him, and what has unconsciously led him to build certain convictions. Our way of thinking is not uprooted from the culture in which we live, but at the same time there are many other cultures that overlap, that coexist with ours without realizing it. We are compelled by legendary and unknown historical forces, which have spread through the ages, in such a way that far from understanding it, in a certain sense we live several cultures in the same historical moment. Although we did not exist in the Victorian era, since this historical stage culminated at the beginning of the 20th century, to a certain extent it is possible to continue to be influenced by the culture that we have internalized in the ideas of certain authors of that time and that to some extent be part of us. Although it is true that the researcher can propose universal ideas and mechanisms, of a nomothetic nature, he also possesses certain social convictions from which he has not been able to escape due to his cultural influence and his historical context that leads him to interpret his own culture as a universal paradigm. Therefore, he believes that he can apply them universally when in fact they are specific to his culture. To the extent that we can transcend beyond our culture, we will get closer and closer to a more extensive and universal thought. While Freud's remarkable discoveries about repression, rationalization, infantile sexuality, transference, among many others, have universal characteristics, that is, they are applicable beyond the culture from which they emerged. However, we can doubt some of his convictions, for example, on the sexual conception of women, perceived practically as a castrated man, and penis envy. Of the natural evil of man, or the universal concept he had of man, influenced by the Enlightenment and humanist philosophy of his time, influenced by bourgeois society, growing capitalism, physiological mechanistic materialism, by the preponderance of biology, world wars, and by their own culture. Therefore, he ignored the human capacity for adaptation in different cultures, without noticing the error involved in taking a model, in this case a European social and cultural paradigm, to explain universal human needs. Freud was unable to realize that there is no single anthropological model. This universal fallacy claims a single explanation and a single truth for all human phenomena. The Western adherence to a single truth has been driven by irrational and historical forces that have been transmuted from a historical religious monotheism into a cultural and scientific monotheism, as we will see later. Many of the Freudian ideas have had to some extent the influence of the Victorian era, and of the culture in which Freud lived, therefore, they cannot be applied universally. Therefore, the unconditional approval of the ideas of any author, regardless of who they are, without previously analyzing their social context, determines to a certain extent that even we, without knowing it and without having lived the time that the author lived, are being influenced to a certain extent and through the ideas of our author, by his own historical space and time. In the example above by the Victorian culture itself that influenced the remarkable author we have studied. When we find ourselves reading a book, watching a video, listening to a lecture by a certain author, whether he is alive or dead, present or absent, depending on the situation, we establish a link or a nexus with that author. The nexus is not only through the absent author, but also indirectly and unconsciously, indirectly receiving the influence of the social context in which said author lived. If it is an extemporaneous author, we will be receiving from him, and through his teachings, the influence of his culture, a culture distant from ours. Their expressions indicate the way of feeling, thinking and being of the author that I am reading, or listening to, they state their emotions, their personal history and contain traits of their culture to which they are or were integrated. I do not believe it is correct to affirm in any of the cases, to be influenced by a single author, when in fact we are influenced by many other living or deceased authors, present or not, embodied in the author that we have studied in depth. Generally we say that an author is influenced only by another author, ignoring the psychic process of transmutation that teaches us that all learning is the product of a construction in time and space, and of a deformation of one content into another, which is propagates historically in time. Historically, certain knowledge is internalized, discarding others, secularizing religious aspects that are distorted and integrated, mimicking different fields of knowledge. Therefore, to be influenced by another, is in reality to be influenced by many unknown others, by affections of others, by social contexts of others, by diverse cultures of others, by different primary groups of others. A library contains the influence of various libraries. Each book in a library contains in itself many other libraries. By questioning aspects of our own culture, we are doing so as well and without being aware of the influence of other unknown cultures whose presence is still latent and present in ours. It is also possible that the nexus and the link occur in a combined way before the same author. While we have a direct relationship with him or her, a personal relationship, communication, learning, and teaching, we establish a bond. But when we personally separate to read their books and articles or to listen to their videos, we establish a bond with it. Person, or persons. We say that communication and learning is linking, when it is built with the other. Knowledge is generational, because we build it generationally. We learn from the living and the dead, from those who are present or absent, from contemporary or extemporaneous authors. We often criticize certain ideas in the present, which were considered absolute truths by previous generations. Many ideas, customs, beliefs, and behaviors that we resist changing, other generations will do for us in the future. Each generation will understand, perceive, interpret, define, and change certain customs that previous generations have resisted changing. Changing certain beliefs, convictions, and ideas can be difficult, sinful, impossible for a certain generation. However, as time passes, these resisted ideas will no longer be tragic. As we learn to be critical of our culture, we can establish changes in it. However, no matter how extensive our critical capacity is, to a greater or lesser extent we are conditioned by our culture, and limited, in such a way that we are not able to realize the influence she has on us. We cannot totally go out to observe it from the outside, we are involved, and we always will be. Therefore, the other generations will be in charge of seeing more clearly what we cannot visualize. We have internalized from our childhood cultural logics that have taken hold and that prevent us from being critical of our own reality. We often tend to universalize practices, beliefs, and social logics that are actually typical of our historical moment. Notable critics, whose investigations transformed our reality, people with a great capacity for self-scrutiny, have not been able to escape to some extent the influence of their own culture. On the other hand, it is important to interpret the author not as a bad subject or good subject, as someone with whom I must agree perfectly, or on the contrary feel uprooted because a perfect ideological agreement with said author is not possible. It is important to interpret him as a subject who has a certain view of reality, which I can elucidate partly correct and partly incorrect according to my personal appreciation of the analysis I make of his writings and teachings. This allows me to assess certain content, without the need to completely eliminate the author, recognizing other valuable content in him. I think it is important to learn to value certain content despite our disagreements. We should not demand that the author's beliefs, values, and convictions perfectly match ours. We must learn to value the work of this author even if we consider it outdated or worthy of a past time, always keeping in mind that his teachings may have been useful to some extent as an inspiration for further learning. Perhaps, without that support, without that previous work, it is possible that we would not have been able to reach further refined conclusions. We always need to rely on a previous platform to be able to project ourselves into knowledge. Whenever we want to make changes, we must assess the previous scope. It is possible to learn from everyone without having to coincide perfectly with everything. Learning is accompanied by tolerance, the ability to listen, recognize, value, and come to understand that the other was not as wrong as we believed, and that we were not as accurate as we assumed. Often we see a partial reality, we tend to interpret it from the extremes, in such a way that we idealize or demonize the other, we perceive him as totally lost or totally correct, depending on whether his ideas coincide perfectly with ours or not. To a greater or lesser extent, we all have our successes and mistakes, and we must humbly accept the existence of intermediate tones, valuing ideas in the thinking of others, which may inspire us. While it is true that there are unavoidable disagreements, often, and for those same disagreements, we reject all the thinking of an author, ignoring that perhaps we can have many points in common. Generally we do not get to know the author well because we leave him immediately, at the moment when he does not fully satisfy our absolute requirements. When we read a certain author, it is possible that some of his ideas conflict with my fundamental ideas which represent an immovable, unquestionable, non-negotiable support. However, this antagonism does not have to eliminate the author in its entirety. We always have something to learn from everyone, even the most controversial authors. We also tend to idealize a certain author when his ideas coincide perfectly with my fundamental ideas, regardless of some superficial disagreements because they represent for me, minor ideas, trivial, which do not conflict with my fundamental ideas. We eliminate the other or idealize them taking into account whether their ideas coincide perfectly with ours or not. We learn through the exchange of ideas, listening to the other and reflecting with him. We must not settle on unshakable convictions. All learning generates changes in the subject, and as we are learning, we are changing. Therefore, it is necessary to leave behind certain convictions that give me some security, but at the same time they do not allow me to move forward. Consequently, all learning generates anxiety because it involves a loss that is necessary for learning. The epistemophilic, Piconian obstacle occurs in the vision of any kind of knowledge. This obstacle or difficulty of approach denounces an attitude of resistance to change. If we consider that mental illness or social difficulties of any kind are accompanied by a resistance to change, in the patient there is often no will to heal, but there is resistance to change, due to a particular state created by him. By analyzing the reason for resistance to change, and what change means for each one, we could see that there were actually two basic fears in every pathology and in the face of every task to begin. They are the two basic fears with which we work permanently, the fear of loss, and the fear of attack. Class given by Dr. Enrique Pichon Riviere on May 13, 1970. Temas de Psicologia Social, Year 4, Number 3. September 1980. Many people do not see nuances, only in black and white, therefore it is very difficult to establish dialogue with them, because they always speak from the certainty, without taking into account nuances and without considering the speech of others important, except when this perfectly matches your ideas. In one of his lectures Sullivan stated that the nipple is probably grasped as a part of a cosmic entity. Gradually it stands out as an attribute of the good mother. Gradually another complex of impressions appears, which, because of the empathic bond, is the bad mother. Objectively, for us, the person referred to is the mother. For the child, they are two people with vague limits, but entirely different. Discrimination between the class of events associated with the good mother and the class of events associated with the bad mother constitutes a primary bifurcation of interpersonal experience, evidence of which persists in many people throughout their lives. Because of this, is that there are people for whom gray does not exist, everything tends to be black or white. Your friends are just wonderful. People they dislike are just unbearable. His love is melodramatic to a point where he confuses his object less when the object is another person equally absorbed in himself. Together by a sustained miracle of accommodation, or ignorance, of each other's erroneous individualistic considerations, two of these people can have a great time together. With other people, however, they are likely to feel disappointed, hurt, misunderstood. Sullivan, 1959, pages 88 to 89. We also learn before the obstacle, the doubt, the contradiction, the different, the heterogeneous, therefore we must learn to see the obstacle as a possibility of change, not as an insurmountable problem, but as an opportunity for reflection in the face of doubt, of improvement and growth. In the field of social psychology, and regarding the work on operative groups, Pichon-Rivière affirms that the clarification process in an operative group, and its dialectical capacity, determine effective work by dissolving the dilemmatic situations that prevent change by pose the problem as yes or no. The existence of intermediate nuances is not taken into account, which prevents the clarification of the obstacle, the change, and where the solution cannot be crystallized by that power struggle between the yes and no being debated in the field of the learning operative group, class. Dictated by Dr. Enrique Pichon-Rivière on May 13, 1970. Temas de Psicologia Social, Year 4, Number 3. September 1980. All natural phenomena exist thanks to their dependent and reciprocal links. Relationships are essential for the support of life itself. In nature, links are not only vitally important in the construction of communication and learning, the link is intrinsically linked with physical, psychic, and biological life, with the organic development of potentialities. Without the existence of links, life would not exist. If a child were to be abandoned, away from all human, social ties, and if he managed to survive by his own means in that condition of isolation, he would be obliged to bond with nature, without obtaining a return of himself from another human being. Without the existence of links, human potentialities will be atrophied. Faced with the non-responsiveness of matter, only despair, the unbearable feeling of loneliness, and madness await you. There is the fantasy in certain children's comics that an abandoned child can develop human language and capabilities, despite having been raised among animals. To explain this phenomenon, I will cite a movie because it is a popular film and because it has a series of symbolisms capable of better illustrating the case. In the film The Castaway, directed by and starring Tom Hanks, some situations were filmed that are interesting to watch. The protagonist suffers an accident when the commercial airplane in which he was traveling falls in the Pacific Ocean. All its crew members die, only the actor swims a short distance and manages to reach a desert island, where he was forced to spend 5 years there. In order not to go crazy, he takes a ball that came in the luggage of the plane, and draws human features on it. He puts her by his side as his companion object, he talks to her, asks her opinions, gets angry with her, punishes her, is happy to see her, misses her by losing her, and sleeps near her every night. He draws a nose, eyes, and a mouth on a background accidentally stained with his own blood. The blood represents the life of the actor that, transferred to matter, vivifies it. By vivifying matter, to some extent the actor himself vivifies himself, enough to avoid going mad and commit suicide. By sharing his blood with matter, and experiencing the fantasy of a bond, it comes to life and ceases to be an inert object for him. The non-responsiveness of the matter no longer causes an intolerable feeling of anxiety, from that moment on the matter shares the actor's blood. In this way, he has managed to suffocate anxiety, fear, uncertainty, despair, the feeling of helplessness, and unbearable loneliness to a certain extent. George Devereux refers to the trauma of the impassivity of matter, that is, there is a panic reaction to the non-responsiveness and impassivity of matter, and as a defense mechanism against this, he tends to impute meanings that it does not have and to interpret them as answers. The need that the organism tends for a response is a fact. The study by Davis 1949 of a socially isolated child and in summary by Mandelbaum 1943 of data from the so-called wolf children, prove that children deprived of social response for a long time, are incapable of developing certain human traits basic. Furthermore, if the absence of response occurs in early childhood, the infant or monkey Harlow, 1962 dies of marasmus or remains psychologically useless for life. Spitz, 1945, 1946, 1949, Spitz and Wolf 1946. Devereux, 1977, p. 58. Due to the influence of the Newtonian Cartesian Darwinian paradigm, European thought was intensely influenced by mechanism and the concept of a strange, distant, and cruel nature, in the midst of which the subject was inscribed. Descartes drew a drastic separation between the body and the mind, the psychophysical parallelism. Unlike the body, it was considered that the soul could not be studied scientifically. Influenced by this paradigm, Auguste Comte could not see a unity between the different knowledge, exalting sociology as superior to the other sciences, which should be subordinated to it. Fragmentary and hierarchical thinking has not allowed us to think about the ecological unity and the reciprocal interdependence of the parts that make up the whole. It has taken us time to understand the reciprocal interaction of natural and social phenomena. The concept of the subject disintegrated from the environment, the influence of social determinism, predestination, Eurocentrism, whose contents have distorted and fragmentary features largely derived from the religious ideas that were manifested in the West. The scientific, reductionist, biologist, instinctivist, and mechanistic paradigm has interpreted the human separated from nature, without considering him an integral being with her. In the 20th century, and after the World Wars, profound ideological changes took place. The Western culture understood that it did not have enough tools to solve the problem of the instability caused by these conflicts. It was desired not to repeat a similar situation that could lead humanity to a general catastrophe again. There was fear of the devastating capacity of nuclear weapons, which could completely destroy humanity. They had already demonstrated their destructive power by being thrown on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Philosophy and Oriental thought were used to gain other knowledge, an alternative that allows a response, a comprehensive view of reality to expand the ability to think and rethink. The contribution of the Eastern philosophy in the construction of a new paradigm in the West has been extremely useful. We can see this influence in the writings of Erich Fromm, Mircea Eliade, Bede Griffiths, in Fritz Perls, and the Gestalt Current, in the monumental 17-volume work of Joseph Needham, called Science and Civilization in China, in Aldous Huxley, Fritjof Capra, and especially in music, religion, aesthetics and philosophy that spread mainly during the 60s. The emergence of Western thought occurred together with the emergence of post-colonial theorists such as Edward Said, Frantz Fanon, Albert Memmi, Homi K. Babha, Gayatri Spivak, José Rabeza, Enrique Dussel. Concepts such as hope and love have an important place in the psychological and psychiatric study as indicated by the research of Sullivan and Fromm. It began to be understood that the human being is not motivated only by instinctual forces, but also by education, and the importance of the influence of social context and culture on human behavior began to be seen more clearly. This gaze towards the East contributed to a certain extent to erode the pillars of Eurocentrism, integrating other knowledge that at a certain historical moment was considered exotic. The human began to be reinterpreted as an interdependent entity, and societies, as open systems. Anthropology understood the human value of each culture in itself, without the need to be compared with the pattern of European society, and the terms savage and primitive, which were used to denote women, were stripped from the dictionary. Non-European cultures. Likewise, from my point of view, monotheistic expansionist forces gradually lost the concept of the only saving and taxing truth, recognizing complementary other truths, which allowed movements such as liberation theology to rise up in our continent. The patriarchal system begins to break down, emerging matriarchal ideas of interaction, brotherhood, universality, material well-being, freedom, equality, unity, love of life, peace, recognizing the value of social bonds of solidarity, as fundamental elements to avoid new confrontations. Warlike. Patriarchal. Footnote: it is very important to read the works of Bachofen and Morgan to understand the concept of patriarchy/matriarchy. End of footnote. Western culture gradually incorporated matriarchal elements, typical of Eastern thought. The dusty writings of Bachofen and Morgan, on matriarchy, were analyzed in greater detail, and reread after a long time of obscurity, in which these works were ignored in Europe. The patriarchal system proved to be a failure, deepening differences, driving societies towards authoritarianism, dictatorships, polluting the soil, water, and air, dragging us towards catastrophic wars and terrorism, towards the nuclear, biological, and chemical threat, and threatening to destroy our planet. The European philosophical and scientific influence planted in the West the concept of life itself as something similar to a clockwork machine and not as a living organism or system. The mechanistic concept of matter was transmuted to the mechanistic concept of human and social relationships, as well as the concept of history as a linear phenomenon. Just as the parts of a machine or an automaton are isolated and interchangeable entities, in the same way, social relations are lived fragmentarily.